You know, I've been doing this work for a really long time now. I've spent decades studying the human brain, how we think, how we process information, and honestly, one of the most consistent patterns I see across every single demographic, every age group, every walk of life is this: we're all overthinking. And I mean constantly. It's like this low-level hum in the background of modern life that most of us don't even realize is happening. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. When I say overthinking is killing you, I'm not being dramatic or trying to get your attention with some clickbait statement. I'm being literal. The physiological impact of chronic overthinking is real, measurable, and frankly, it's one of the most underestimated health crises we're facing right now. You won't see it on the news. You won't see public health warnings about it, but the damage is happening in real time to millions of people. I was reminded of this just recently. I was having coffee with a colleague of mine, and she was telling me about a patient she'd seen that morning, a 34-year-old woman who came in with chest pains, classic presentation. So naturally, you'd think heart issue, right? They run all the tests, EKG, blood work, imaging, everything comes back normal. And then my colleague starts digging deeper. She asks about her life, her stress levels, what's been going on. Turns out this woman had spent the last 6 months in a mental loop, just constantly replaying conversations, worrying about what her boss thought about her presentation from 3 months ago, catastrophizing about her relationship, wondering if she was making good decisions for her kids. Her body was literally paying the price for her mind's inability to stop. This is what we're dealing with. And the really insidious part, most of us don't even realize it's happening. We think we're just being thoughtful, we think we're being careful, we think we're preparing for potential problems. But what we're actually doing is hijacking our own nervous system and keeping it in a state of chronic activation. We're essentially telling our body that there's a threat over and over again until our body starts to break down. I want to be really clear about something from the start here. Thinking is important. Analysis is important. Planning is important. I'm not here to tell you to stop thinking. That would be insane, but there's a massive difference between productive thinking and obsessive overthinking, and that line, it's a lot closer than most people think. The problem is that our brains evolved in an environment where that overthinking response actually served us. Back when our ancestors were walking across the savannah, if they heard a rustling in the bushes, it was genuinely useful to run through a bunch of scenarios in your mind. What could it be? Is it dangerous? What would I do if it was a predator? That's overthinking in a way, but it was survival-oriented overthinking. It had a clear endpoint. Either the predator showed up or it didn't. Either they had to run or they were safe. Now fast forward to today, we're living with the same brain hardware running on software that's completely mismatched to our environment. We get a text message from someone that seems a little short, and suddenly we're running the same threat detection software. We're spinning through endless scenarios. Did I offend them? Are they mad at me? What did I do wrong? Is this relationship in trouble? And here's the thing, there's no rustling that becomes a predator. The threat never materializes. We just keep running the simulation over and over and over again. And our bodies don't know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. When you're in that loop of overthinking, your nervous system is flooding your body with cortisol and adrenaline, just like it would if there was actually a saber-toothed tiger walking toward you. Your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure rises, your immune system gets suppressed, your digestion gets impaired, your sleep gets disrupted. All of these systems that are supposed to be working to keep you healthy are instead being diverted to prepare you for a threat that doesn't actually exist. And I want to be really honest with you here. This is something I see in my own life too. I'm not standing here as someone who's figured it all out, immune to overthinking. I'm someone who has to actively work against my brain's natural tendency to do this. I'll be lying in bed at night and I'll catch myself replaying a conversation from that day, wondering about what someone meant when they said something, or worrying about an upcoming presentation. I have to consciously interrupt that pattern and remind myself of what I know to be true about how the mind works. The reason I'm telling you all this is because I think the first step to dealing with overthinking is actually understanding it. It's understanding that this isn't a character flaw. It's not because you're broken or damaged or somehow more anxious than other people. It's because you have a normal human brain that evolved under certain conditions, and now you're living in a radically different environment. And that mismatch creates this constant pressure. Now, I've spent a lot of my career looking at the research on this, and the data is pretty sobering. We're looking at links between chronic overthinking and anxiety disorders, depression, sleep disorders, heart disease, weakened immune function, chronic pain, digestive issues. The list goes on. And in many cases, we're not just talking about correlation. We're talking about direct causal pathways. The overthinking is actually creating the physical health problems. There was a study that really stuck with me a few years back. They followed people who reported high levels of rumination. That's the technical term for what we've been calling overthinking. And they tracked their health outcomes over several years. Compared to people with lower levels of rumination, the high rumination group had significantly higher rates of inflammation markers in their blood. They had more cardiovascular problems. They had more metabolic issues. And when the researchers looked at the mechanism, it came down to exactly what I've been describing: the chronic activation of the stress response system. So here's what I want you to understand as we go through this together. This is not theoretical. This is not something that's interesting from an academic standpoint, but doesn't apply to real life. The overthinking that's happening in your head right now, the loops you might be stuck in, the scenarios you're running through, the replaying of conversations, the what ifs, the catastrophizing, that's literally changing your physiology. It's affecting your heart, your gut, your brain chemistry, your immune system, your ability to sleep, your metabolism, all of it. And here's the good news. Once you understand the mechanism, once you understand how this is actually working, you can do something about it. You can start to break these patterns. You can start to rewire your nervous system. You can start to take back control of your mind instead of letting your mind run away with you. That's really what this is all about. This isn't me telling you to just stop overthinking. That's not how the brain works. And anyone who tells you that you just need to worry less or think less is fundamentally misunderstanding what's going on. This is about understanding the mechanism and then using that understanding to implement specific practical strategies that actually work. Throughout this talk, I'm going to walk you through all of this. We're going to look at how overthinking happens in the brain at a neurological level. We're going to talk about the physical consequences, not just in abstract terms, but in very concrete ways that relate to your actual health. And then we're going to get into the practical stuff, the things you can actually do starting today to interrupt these patterns and start moving toward a healthier, calmer way of being. So let's get into it. Part 1, how overthinking actually works in your brain, 1,500 words. If you want to understand overthinking, you need to understand something about how your brain is structured and how it evolved. And I'm going to try to make this accessible without oversimplifying it too much. Your brain, in many ways, is like 3 different brains stacked on top of each other. There's the ancient reptilian brain at the very bottom that handles basic survival functions like breathing and heart rate. There's the limbic system, or emotional brain, in the middle. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, on top. This model isn't perfect, but it's useful for understanding what we're talking about. Now, the reptilian brain and the limbic system, they're fast. They react. They don't think. If there's a threat, they respond. This is incredibly useful for survival. You touch a hot stove, your hand pulls back before you're even consciously aware of it. You see something that scares you, your fight or flight response kicks in before you've had time to think it through. The prefrontal cortex, on the other hand, is slow. It's thoughtful. It can imagine things that haven't happened. It can think about the future. It can consider different perspectives. This is where human beings really distinguish ourselves as a species. We can imagine, we can plan, we can think about abstract concepts. Here's the problem. Under normal circumstances, these 3 systems are supposed to work together in a balanced way. The limbic system gets activated by something that might be a threat. It sends a signal up to the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex evaluates the actual threat level, and sends back a message saying, okay, there's no actual danger here, stand down. The limbic system receives that message and you start to calm down. But in the modern world, we've created a situation where this system gets all tangled up. Here's how it typically happens. Something happens. Maybe it's genuinely stressful, or maybe it's something minor. Let's say you get feedback at work that wasn't entirely positive. Your limbic system gets activated. There's a threat signal, but here's where it gets weird. Your prefrontal cortex, instead of simply evaluating whether there's actual danger, starts to think about it. It imagines scenarios. It starts to spin narratives. What did that feedback really mean? Are they thinking I'm not good at my job? Is my job in jeopardy? What would happen if I lost my job? How would I pay my bills? My God, am I going to become homeless? And each of these thoughts activates the threat response a little bit more. So your limbic system stays activated, your body stays in stress mode, and your prefrontal cortex is stuck in this loop, thinking about the threat that it's itself creating through imagination. This is overthinking. It's when your thinking brain gets caught in a feedback loop with your emotional brain, and they end up amplifying each other instead of balancing each other out. Now, why does this happen so easily? Part of it is what researchers call negative bias. Humans, for evolutionary reasons, are much more likely to think about threats than opportunities. If our ancestors spent half their mental energy thinking about how to find food, and the other half thinking about how to avoid being eaten, the ones who spent more mental energy on avoiding being eaten tended to survive. So we inherited brains that are fundamentally biased toward threat detection. This was great when threats were physical and immediate. It's terrible when we're using that same threat detection system to analyze social interactions and imagine future scenarios that may never happen. There's also something called rumination, which is the technical term for overthinking. Research has shown that rumination activates specific neural pathways in the brain. When you're ruminating, there's increased activity in what's called the default mode network. This is a network of brain regions that's active when you're not focused on the external world, when you're thinking about yourself, your problems, your worries. The thing about rumination is that it feels productive. It feels like you're doing something, your brain is working hard, you're trying to solve the problem. But here's the thing, rumination is not actually productive problem solving. True problem solving involves identifying a problem, generating solutions, evaluating those solutions, and then implementing one. Rumination, by contrast, is just endlessly cycling through the same thoughts without actually reaching any resolution or action. I see this in people all the time. Someone will come to me saying they've been thinking about the same problem for weeks. They've been going over it again and again. They feel exhausted. But when I ask them what actions they've taken to address the problem, or what new information they've gathered, or how their thinking has evolved, they often realize they haven't really made any progress. They've just been stuck in the loop. The other thing that happens is what I call catastrophic extrapolation. This is where you start with a minor event and your mind fast forwards to the worst possible outcome. Someone's a little standoffish with you, and suddenly in your mind they hate you, and everyone will eventually hate you, and you'll end up alone. You make a small mistake at work, and you're imagining yourself getting fired, being unable to find another job, losing your house. Your brain is literally creating a hypothetical future scenario, and your body is responding to that scenario like it's real. Because from a neurochemical perspective, your body doesn't know the difference between a real threat and an imagined one. The stress hormones flood your system the same way either way. And then there's the issue of rumination and sleep. This is a big one. If you're an overthinker, you probably have trouble sleeping. I talk to so many people who lie awake at night with their mind racing, and this makes sense from a neurological standpoint. Your brain is activated, your nervous system is in a state of arousal, and without sleep, everything gets worse. Your emotional regulation gets worse. Your ability to think clearly gets worse. Your immune function gets worse. You become even more prone to overthinking. So you get this vicious cycle where the overthinking disrupts your sleep, and the disrupted sleep makes the overthinking worse. There's also something really important happening at the neurochemical level. Chronic overthinking and chronic stress lead to changes in your brain chemistry. Your serotonin levels drop. Your dopamine regulation gets disrupted. Your cortisol levels stay elevated. These aren't just mood-related. These have impacts all throughout your body. Low serotonin is linked to depression and anxiety. Disrupted dopamine regulation affects motivation and reward processing. Elevated cortisol causes inflammation throughout the body. Over time, with chronic overthinking and chronic stress, your brain actually changes structurally. The amygdala, the part of your brain that processes fear and threat, actually gets larger and more reactive. The prefrontal cortex, the part that's supposed to regulate and calm things down, actually gets smaller and less effective. Literally, chronic stress and overthinking are rewiring your brain in ways that make you more anxious and less able to regulate yourself. This is why simply telling someone to stop worrying or stop thinking about something doesn't work. You can't just willpower your way out of this. The neural pathways have been reinforced. The neurochemistry has changed. You need to actually intervene in a way that works with how the brain actually functions. Part 2. The physical toll. What overthinking actually does to your body. 1,500 words. Let me shift gears now and talk about what's actually happening in your body when you're caught in these overthinking loops, because this is where it gets really concrete. This isn't abstract neuroscience anymore. These are things that are literally affecting your health right now. When you activate your stress response system through overthinking, the first thing that happens is the release of stress hormones. Your pituitary gland releases ACTH, which tells your adrenal glands to release adrenaline and cortisol. These are powerful hormones. They serve a purpose in genuine emergency situations. They increase your heart rate and blood pressure so more blood gets to your muscles. They shift glucose into your bloodstream for quick energy. They suppress your immune function because in a true emergency, fighting for your life is more important than fighting off an infection. But here's the thing, these changes are expensive. They're metabolically expensive. If you're activating this system once in a while, your body can handle it fine. It's designed to handle it. But if you're activating it chronically through constant overthinking, you start to see real problems. Your cardiovascular system takes a big hit. That elevated heart rate and blood pressure, if it's happening chronically, damages your blood vessels. It increases your risk of hypertension and heart disease. I mentioned that study earlier about the inflammation markers. The chronic activation of the stress response system drives inflammation throughout your body, and inflammation is now recognized as a root cause of many chronic diseases. Your digestive system also suffers. Under stress, your body shunts blood away from your digestive organs and toward your muscles. Your parasympathetic nervous system, the system that's supposed to manage digestion, gets suppressed. Your stomach acid production changes. You might develop irritable bowel syndrome or inflammatory bowel disease if you're genetically predisposed. You might develop acid reflux. Your nutrient absorption gets compromised. And this is something a lot of people don't realize. A huge portion of people who come to me with digestive issues, and I'm talking about people who've seen multiple gastroenterologists and haven't gotten relief, they're really dealing with a problem that's rooted in chronic overthinking and stress. Your immune system is profoundly affected. When you're in a state of chronic stress, your immune system doesn't function optimally. You get sick more easily. You recover from illness more slowly. If you have an autoimmune condition, stress can trigger flare-ups. You're more susceptible to viral infections, bacterial infections, all of it. Because your body has decided that fighting a saber-toothed tiger is more important than maintaining immune surveillance. Your sleep is disrupted. This is huge. Sleep is when your brain does its maintenance. It consolidates memories. It clears out metabolic waste. It regulates hormones. When you can't sleep because your mind is racing with overthinking, you're essentially running your brain on a deficit. Most people don't realize how profoundly this affects everything else. A study came out a few years ago showing that people with chronic insomnia have increased mortality rates similar to people with heart disease. That's how serious sleep deprivation is. And when your sleep is disrupted, everything cascades. Your glucose metabolism gets worse, your hormone regulation gets worse, your emotional regulation gets worse. You become more irritable, you have less patience, you're more prone to overthinking. So again, vicious cycle. Your metabolic system gets impaired. When you're chronically stressed, your body is resistant to insulin. Your blood sugar regulation gets worse. You're more prone to developing type 2 diabetes. You gain weight more easily because cortisol drives fat storage, particularly in the abdomen. And the weight gain, of course, can trigger more overthinking because now you're worried about your health and your appearance. There's also what happens to your thyroid and your hormone system more broadly. Chronic stress suppresses thyroid function, it disrupts your sex hormones, it increases prolactin, which can have effects on fertility and sexual function. It disrupts your circadian rhythms, which affects everything. I want to emphasize something here. These aren't just uncomfortable, they're not just unpleasant. These are real pathological changes. We're talking about increased risk of heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, dementia, autoimmune disease. Overthinking isn't just bad for your mood, it's bad for your physical health in measurable, significant ways. There was a study published in the Journal of the American Heart Association that followed people over the course of about 10 years. They measured how much each person tended to ruminate, to overthink and worry, and they tracked their health outcomes. The people in the highest rumination group had something like a 40% increased risk of cardiovascular events compared to the lowest rumination group, 40%. That's not nothing. That's a significant public health issue. And here's something that really gets me. If you went to your doctor and said, I'm experiencing constant overthinking and worry, and you asked them what the health implications are, most doctors would probably minimize it. They might refer you to a therapist, they might offer you antidepressants, but they wouldn't necessarily connect it to your increased cardiovascular risk or your immune dysfunction or your blood sugar dysregulation. So you might be walking around with this condition that's literally damaging your health and nobody's connecting the dots. The other thing I think is really important to talk about is resilience. When you're chronically stressed and overthinking, your resilience actually decreases. You become more fragile. Minor stressors that normally wouldn't bother you suddenly feel overwhelming. You're more prone to getting depressed. You're more vulnerable to other mental health conditions. It's like your system is already operating at maximum capacity, so anything additional pushes you over the edge. And then there's the issue of pain. Chronic pain is very often tied to chronic stress and overthinking. When you're stressed, your muscles tighten. Your pain sensitivity actually increases through neurological mechanisms. If you have any underlying musculoskeletal issues, the stress and overthinking will make them worse. And then the pain triggers more overthinking, more worry, more stress, another vicious cycle. What strikes me most about all of this is how silent it is. These changes are happening, the inflammation is building, your cardiovascular system is being stressed, your immune system is being suppressed, and you might not notice any dramatic symptoms. You just feel tired, your neck is tight, you have occasional headaches, your digestion is a bit off, you're not sleeping as well. None of these things individually seem like a big deal, but they're all markers of a system that's being chronically stressed. Part 3. Why we can't just stop overthinking, 1,000 words. So here's something that I think gets really misunderstood. People often come to me saying, I know I'm overthinking, I know it's not helping, why can't I just stop? And they sound frustrated like they should have already figured this out. I get it. It sounds simple. Don't think about it. But that's like telling someone with anxiety to just calm down or telling someone with depression to just be happy. It's well-intentioned, but it fundamentally misunderstands how the human brain works. Here's why you can't just stop overthinking through willpower alone. First, your brain is built for this. The pathways that allow you to anticipate problems, to imagine future scenarios, to be cautious, these are evolutionarily advantageous traits. They helped humans survive. They helped us plan, prepare, think through complex problems. You can't just disable that without consequences. It's too integral to how your brain works. Second, the more you try to suppress a thought, the more likely it is to come back. This is something called the ironic rebound effect, or thought suppression paradox. There was a famous study where researchers told people not to think about white bears. And what happened? That's right. They couldn't stop thinking about white bears. In fact, they thought about white bears more than the control group, who was allowed to think about whatever they wanted. The same principle applies to overthinking. If you try to white-knuckle your way to not thinking about something, you'll often end up thinking about it more. You create a sort of internal struggle, and that struggle is itself stressful. Third, by the time you're dealing with chronic overthinking, it's deeply wired into your nervous system. Your brain has learned that overthinking is the way you deal with uncertainty or threat. It's become automatic. Automatic processes are really hard to change through conscious effort alone. Fourth, you're fighting against your default mode network. And I mentioned this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. When you're not focused on something external, your brain naturally drifts into this pattern of thinking about yourself, your problems, your worries. This is the default mode. So if you're not actively redirecting your attention, you'll naturally drift back into overthinking. And then there's the fact that overthinking sometimes does solve problems. Let me be clear about this. Not all thinking about your problems is overthinking. Sometimes you need to sit down and think through a problem and figure out a solution. The issue is distinguishing between that kind of productive problem solving and the rumination that doesn't actually help. The thing is, overthinking occasionally does produce a solution, or it produces something that feels like a solution. Maybe you spend an evening worrying about a presentation at work, and then you have an insight about how to structure it. Your brain goes, "See, that worrying was useful. Let's do more of that." And so it learns to rely on overthinking as a problem-solving strategy. Except most of the time it's not productive. Most of the time you're just spinning in circles. But your brain has learned to mistake the feeling of mental activity for actual productivity.